Let's talk a bit about tariffs, the complexities that come with that. It's not new. You've basically spent your whole career navigating this. How big of a challenge was changing tariffs or tariff disruption in your career?
If an organization right now, from a supply chain perspective, was caught with what are we going to do with these tariffs, then they weren't doing their job.
On this episode of Executive Edge, Simon sits down with Kevin Petrie, former Chief Procurement and Supply Chain Officer. He shares sharp insights on leadership and supply chain strategy.
At the end of the day, if you look at the overall strategy from a supply chain perspective, it is about risk. You need to have a strategy, not only a plan A, but a plan B and a plan C. If you're buying from a supplier that's located in London, where are their materials coming from? And then it is about managing that risk. Tariffs is just one of many risks that are involved in your supply chain. What I would say is, for any procurement supply chain folks that are out there.
Hi, everyone. As your host, Simon Rycraft here. Welcome to another recording of the now called Executive Edge, formerly known as Experts Uncut. Very excited to have with me somewhat of a legend in the procurement and supply chain world, Kevin Petrie. Thanks for coming on, Kevin. How are you?
Great. Thank you, Simon. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here this morning.
Everyone, Kevin is currently an adjunct professor at California State University, Northridge, where he teaches on supply chain management, supply chain strategy. Prior to his teaching role and some other philanthropic things that we'll jump into and retirement from corporate life, Kevin spent 23 years at Nestlé. I think everyone's heard of Nestlé, or at least consume some of their products, but it's a $100 billion consumer products company. Kevin started in purchasing, rose through the ranks, and held both the CPO, Chief Procurement, as well as Chief Supply Chain Officer roles here in North America. So very excited to chat to you, Kevin. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Simon. I appreciate it.
So, I mean, we met, I don't know how long ago it was. I think it could have been 10, it could have been 12 or 13 years ago. But worked together briefly. I have a lot of fond memories of time in LA. So, I'm glad that we were able to reconnect to do this recording. We both love biographies, right? So it's one of the reasons I enjoy having these conversations, to be honest. So I don't want to miss off going down that rabbit hole to some extent with you, so we can learn a bit more about you as an individual. Who's Kevin? I'm addicted to coffee. I always have been. It's a big passion of mine. But it sounds like, from our discussions about your career, is it actually started very much early on, right? I mean, when Nestlé was a client of yours and you were a coffee trader. Tell us a bit about that. Were you physically based in Manhattan? Was that the original role?
Yeah, so when I graduated from college in New Jersey, Ramapo College, shout out to them, graduated with a business degree, and I was always very interested in international things, growing up with my Irish grandparents in the house, so, was always excited about seeing the world, and I was also excited about trading, trading something. And I actually worked with a headhunter that said, hey, the commodity world is something that's really growing. So this is back in 1987. And I interviewed with a company called Gill & Duffus. Gill & Duffus was this British company that had a coffee, cocoa, and sugar trading operation. They were on 130 John Street, and got this fantastic job working with the coffee group. And at that time when I joined, it was kind of internship, if you will. So I worked in what they called was traffic. So traffic was about warehousing, and it was about logistics, and it was about supply and demand planning. And what would take place is that the traders would buy coffee. That coffee would then be delivered to the United States, and then it would go to companies like Nestlé. So it was the coffee industry, and it was global, and it was this moving of coffee from places like Brazil and from the Philippines and from India that would come to the U.S., and it would eventually get to Folgers and to Nestle and Kraft, and it was just fascinating. And again, fast forward, it's no longer called traffic; it's now called supply chain. So, so my career began in supply chain, but it was called traffic at that point in time. And I spent about a year and a half with Gill and Duffus, just learning everything I can about coffee and about the movement of coffee, and then the trading of coffee, where it came from, and how derivatives worked. And then I was offered a position to go work for Cargill. So
Okay.
Cargill, the $100 billion privately owned company based in Minneapolis, had just acquired a number of small little coffee companies in New York.
Okay.
So they were bringing all these things together, and they were on 45 Broadway. And I went there to interview, and thought, my God, this is fascinating. You know, a much bigger company, not just coffee, but many, many different products. And again, I started in traffic, and it was much bigger, a lot more products that were going on. And I was really interested in the trading aspect of it. So after a year of doing supply chain, I got involved in doing the trading of coffee, where I learned all about the derivatives of the futures market in London and in New York, and then currency to trade the currency. And of course, Nestle was one of the big customers of Cargill.
Okay.
I was able to then travel to numerous different countries to go work with the farmers. So my first area of trading coffee was Robusta coffee. And
Okay.
my first trip was to go to Brazil. So Brazil being the largest producer of coffee in the world. So I was able to go to the Cargill office there, go travel to see the farmers. So you saw from the tree all the way to the processing part, to go from the cherry to the green bean that gets roasted and turned into coffee. So through the 8.5 year career with Cargill, it was going to Asia, going to Latin America to see all about coffee. So seeing all the logistics, or the supply chain part of it, and then the trading of it. And then I started working very closely with Nestle and Procter and Gamble, Folger, to look at, hey, how could this really meet together? And it just so happened that Nestle had decided to close down their beverage division in San Francisco and move it to Glendale, California. And no one wanted to move from San Francisco down to Glendale. So yet another headhunter called and said, Kevin, would you be interested in being the coffee buyer for Nestle in Glendale? So I jumped at the chance and moved with my wife, who also worked at Cargill, and our two daughters. They were 2.5 and just born, and we moved here to this home a long time ago, and joined Nestle as the coffee buyer. And then over my career, it went from being the coffee buyer to then cocoa and sugar and fats and oils and energy, and then started working in some other aspects within Nestle. And then we did a huge procurement reorganization, which we would have worked with your previous organization to put together some a model from a procurement perspective to increase the overall value that Nestle could bring to the consumer from a procurement perspective. So through those projects, I became the Chief Procurement Officer for the U.S. And did that for 3 years. And then I was asked to move to Vevey, Switzerland, to be the global head of procurement for Nestle. So again, moved the family. This would have been 12 years later. The kids are now 12 and 14. And we moved to Switzerland. And I became the Chief Procurement Officer for Nestle globally, with a 60 billion Swiss franc budget, managing everything within the company. So from the commodities to ingredients to packaging, and then all the indirect materials, so marketing, travel, etc. And it was just a fascinating 4 years of traveling around the world, and hit about 50 different countries, and it was just fascinating to be able to be part of that overall part of Nestle. And then my wife was not so keen on living in Switzerland, so she said, not in so many words, either the job or the family, and I chose the family. And smart move. And I asked my boss, Jose Lopez, God rest his soul, fantastic boss. I said, Jose, I need to go back home. And he said, great. Well, you did a great job here. And I went back to the U.S. as the Chief Supply Chain Officer for Nestle in the United States. So it kind of came full circle, starting with supply chain, went into procurement, and then the last 5 years of my career was spent running the supply chain for Nestle in the United States. So that's my my Reader's Digest career. Probably more than what you needed, right?
No, it's fascinating. I mean, some of the best CPOs as well as supply chain people that I've ever worked with are ones who have had that kind of rotational element to their career, that really understand the core function and have exposure to that of those different kind of areas and activities. Let's talk a bit about core supply chain, and specifically at least travel. Let me ask there. So outside of where you physically lived, you have a top location or country that you just really enjoyed traveling to and going back to, either for business and or pleasure? I mean, it's you've been everywhere, right? So by the sounds of it.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I always approach things from the standpoint of there's great things everywhere. So as I went to a new country, it was always about learning about their culture. So anywhere that I went, I would do some homework beforehand to understand the culture and what goes on there. So connecting with the people within Nestle, within the procurement organization, of making sure that you touch them from a personal standpoint. So understanding how their culture operates. So, I would tell you there were certain places I never thought I would go in my entire life. So I went to Russia. It was fascinating, to see the Red Square and the Kremlin, and then traveling to the agricultural parts in the southern part of Russia was just absolutely fantastic and just blew my mind in regards to the culture that was there, and their pride in agriculture, and their pride in their overall culture. So that was something that I'll never forget. The other place I never thought I would go to is China, and spent quite a few had quite a few trips going to China. My wife was actually born in Hong Kong, and then she lived in Guatemala. So I didn't think I'd ever go to China, and again, another place that was just fascinating. So going from Beijing to Guangzhou to Yunnan. Yunnan is where Nestle invested a lot of money in coffee. Yunnan is known for tea, but there was an opportunity to develop that community beyond tea into coffee. So going to the coffee region in Yunnan to see farmers and meeting with the farmers, and a number of families actually had plaques on their homes to show that Nestle's involvement in coffee allowed them to make enough money to be able to send their kids to school, or to buy a new car, or to do something to help improve their life. So those two areas, I'll have to say, really touched my heart from a standpoint of, hey, what Nestle was doing to be able to improve the overall world. And then the last part was Africa. Never thought I would go to Africa, and to be able to go to the Ivory Coast or Ghana or South Africa. And again, seeing the impact that Nestle had made from a cocoa standpoint, from a coffee standpoint, and other products, where their standard of living it's challenging. Every day when they wake up, they're not sure that they're going to have electricity or they're going to have water, but there's no complaints. It always is about, hey, let's move onwards and upwards, and let's figure out how we're going to solve the challenges that we face in a way to help people out. So those are kind of my three sort of, Africa's a big country, but yeah, Ghana, China, and Russia, going to Moscow. Yeah.
I love it. So with the teaching that you're doing currently as well, one thing that's always fascinated me, is just the complexity of supply chain, specifically within food. I don't think up until probably a couple of decades ago, I truly appreciated the number of it's thousands of people and lanes and routes that are involved in just producing one single product. I remember I did some work for a hummus manufacturer, right? I'll go without impacting confidentiality, but they had tahine, right, or tahini, which is the main flavoring that goes into hummus. It's the roasted flavor that everyone, when they say they love hummus, they love tahine, right? And in the Middle East, a lot of the times they will actually take tahine themselves and just spread it on bread, right, versus mixing it up into a thicker paste with other ingredients. I think it's lemon and olive oil and garlic as we know it today. But the tahini is sesame seed. It's round, it's grounded and then it's roasted. And I think this client purchased most of the sesame seed from Ethiopia. Right. The seed itself was then it was the Ethiopian, I want to say, seed exchange, I think it was, right? Major, massive warehouse, one of the biggest seed exchanges in the world. And location and exchange, it probably hasn't changed for hundreds of years. So they would acquire the seed there. It would then get shipped, I think, to, it was Israel and Turkey. They actually had two suppliers where they would grind into a paste, the tahine paste, put this in vats, and then ship it over to the US. I think it was Richmond, Virginia, and then they would fly in frozen garlic, right, or air frozen garlic from China, and then get some of the other ingredients from North America just to make this hummus that everyone just then finds on the shelves. But how do you explain that complexity to the students from a strategy perspective? Because every single product, right, it's that matrix, that myriad. There's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of steps in the process for every single group of products that you're producing in a consumer products company. So how do you talk to them about how important it is to actually understand that supply chain, how you manage it, avoid risk and stuff like that? How do you get that across?
Yeah, that's so, Simon, that's a great question, because I will tell you that the students that I'm teaching are all global supply chain management majors.
Okay.
And they're all seniors, so the management class would come in their fall, and then the strategy class would come in the spring, which is the capstone class for the students.
Okay.
Before I get them, they would have done some logistics and some transportation classes. And so the first time I get them in the management class or some in the strategy class, they really don't appreciate what goes on in a supply chain exactly to the point that you had just made. Mm-hmm. I explain it to them from a value chain perspective. And that value chain and utilizing food would be going right back to the farmer. And what I do is, kind of put up on a chart, here's the value chain, and all of this is supply chain. And I'll have to say, I've really tried to emphasize to the students is it's about each one of the parts in the supply chain is a job. So what I was trying to do is connect to them of not this big theory of this is what supply chain looks like, but at the end of the day, their goal isn't to get an A, from my perspective. The goal isn't to graduate. The goal is to get a job. And so looking at that value chain and looking at each one of those components and then diving deeper. So if you start with here is procurement, and then here is the transportation, and here is the warehousing, and here's the supply planning, here's the demand planning, here is the customer service, here is the data analytics that supports all of these things. And then in each class, I will go through going deeper into each one of those things. So from a supply and demand planning of, hey, here's the customer, and here's sales, and how they all connect. So I try to bring it to life from a standpoint of my career, so they understand that each one of these are a job. And if there's something that they're interested in, I can then help them get a little bit more detail in regards to what would be great for them from a career perspective.
I don't know if this is a recent evolution, definitely something in the last decade, where marketing and labeling have actually taken this on board as a way to interact and communicate to the customer, right? So now you'll see pictures of farmers on the side of labels for certain products, right, that talk about the origin. I think that's for me, that's super interesting when I see that, and it helps me connect with product. I guess one of the important reason to have that early stage part of the economy in the trading side, right? Like Cargill provides that first step of the supply chain because they're out, they have the relationships with the farmers, right? They're working with the local governments. they're able to provide alternate sources of supply to kind of feed into the consumer product businesses. Let's talk a bit. This is obviously topical. It's relevant in everyone's mind when we talk about tariffs, right? But tariffs and the supply chain resilience, right, is the key word at the moment. The complexities that come with that, it's not new, right? Like, it's not this year suddenly all these businesses have had to worry about changing tariffs. I mean, you've basically spent your whole career navigating this from a trading perspective, right, to kind of maximize profits, but also secure supply, later to having to manage, So how big of a challenge, was changing tariffs or tariff disruption in your career? Any kind of guidance to, supply chain managers who are going through this for the first time, or chief supply chain officers that kind of, where this is having a big impact? Any general guidance?
Yeah, Simon, that's a great question. And as you can imagine, within the this last semester, which finished last Thursday, there was a lot of questions in regards to tariffs because it was in the news every day, as you're aware. It just so happens that one of the chapters in the book is about determining your global location for a supply chain perspective. And in that chapter, it talks about the evolution of GATT into the World Trade Organization. And as of 2021, there was 349 trade agreements globally.
Right.
So to the point was, this is not new. There is a global organization that manages these things. And in my perspective on this whole thing was, as I told them, hey, if an organization right now, from a supply chain perspective, was caught with what are we going to do with these tariffs, then they weren't doing their job. So at the end of the day, if you look at the overall strategy from a supply chain perspective, as you had pointed out, it is about risk. And if you look at the risk that's inherent in your overall supply chain, you need to have a strategy, not only a plan A, but a plan B and a plan C. So this tariff part with the current administration, in fact, in the first administration also had tariffs. Mm-hmm. So I did bring in a guest speaker who was the CPO of a food company, came in last year and talked about what they had just presented to their board about the tariffs. Mm-hmm. And it was about, we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. However, we have mapped out exactly where all of our materials come from. Mm-hmm. And then they looked at what the risk areas would be. They started then taking a look at how we could have suppliers in locations that were not high risk from a country standpoint. So if you had a lot of things in China, which potentially could be an issue, it was about how do we develop, from a supplier relationship management standpoint, another supplier in a different region that is lower risk. So what I would say is, for any procurement supply chain folks that are out there, you really do need to understand where your products have come from. So if you're buying from a supplier that's located in London or in Sao Paulo or in LA, where are their materials coming from? So understanding where they come from, and then it is about managing that risk. Yes, tariffs are one of those things, but so is weather, so is currency, so is their political environment, so is the trade routes from that particular area. So trade is only one of many things that are a risk. And then from a supply chain perspective, back to the time spent with the folks in Africa and specifically Ghana, it was about, we're going to have a challenge every single day, and how can we take that challenge and turn that into an opportunity? So from that supply chain perspective, anything that comes at you, don't look at it as a negative, look at it from a positive. And what is the opportunity, and how can we create a competitive advantage and turn our supply chain into a competitive advantage for the company? So again, back to understanding exactly where it comes from, looking at an overall risk matrix, and determining where are the opportunities within this. And so again, tariffs was something that, yes, I talked about in class, but it was really about the larger strategy from a supply chain perspective, and tariffs is just one of many risks that are involved in your supply chain.
I love the way that you said, I mean, it's ultimately, to kind of paraphrase it if I can, like stability, or your ability to control stability is a competitive advantage, right? Because of the fact that these disruptions are just ongoing. If you can be able to plan, if you're able to plan ahead effectively and then mitigate faster than the competition, then that is a competitive edge, right? Especially when these are things outside of the control. How did, when you were running supply chain, there are tools, right, that map out supply chain risk, and and automated alerts and reports and all these dashboards that you get, right? When you were a trader, how did you have was there an analyst team that worked on the trading desk that would kind of give you insights based on the latest news? Did they have intelligence, from people that were on the ground in certain countries that would send them, memos, right? Or, pick up the phone and give them updates on what they think were coming down the line, so you could plan out your futures strategy and stuff like that? I mean, how did that differ to today's day and age of the internet and, and more information than anyone needs? Was it harder or just different?
Yes, so different certainly is the word I would pick. And yes, when I started in my career, there was no internet, there was no email, and information was value. It was the thing. If you had the information, you're the one that was going to be successful in your corporation. So there was telexes. I don't know if you were young enough to remember telexes, but there was actually a room of people with telexes that it was kind of your email, instant messaging, if you will, and you would get information about weather that would take place in Brazil. So I just remember, coffee being the Brazil being the biggest thing in coffee. It was about, is there going to be a frost, and is there enough rain, and how is the flowering coming through? So yes, it was about having people on the ground, because information was power, and the more you had your tentacles into these particular areas that could impact your commodity, you could make better decisions. As the advent of the internet came through and information became instantaneous, and there wasn't a competitive advantage of you having your tentacles in, because everybody had that information. It was really about the data analytics. So I think that's where things separate between the old days to the new days. It is, to your point, there's so much of this information that's coming through. How do you separate the wheat from the chaff? And how do you ensure that all of this information comes through? Where is that real value? So all this information that comes through, there's a lot of noise. And how do you separate the noise to really get to those kernels of things that are going to create that competitive advantage for you as a corporation? And how do you add value to your customer and your consumer? So it's changed a lot because of the amount of information that's out there. But again, it's about, how do I focus in on the things that are really, truly going to make an impact on the products that you're there? So how do I, again, eliminate the noise, and how do I get to the true value? So someone that gets up and starts talking about many different things, it's not about the emotion, it's about the message. And what are those kernels of the message that I can utilize to make the right decisions?
So I guess to some extent, it's acknowledge the fact that everyone and every corporation has blind spots.
Yeah.
Find out what those blind spots are, because they're probably specific to you from a supply chain perspective, and then do everything you physically can in your power and your team's power to fill those gaps, right? And then plan and operate based off the back of that. Super cool. Kevin, I want to say thank you for coming on. I think the students that you're currently teaching are super lucky, right, to have an exec with such a depth of experience coming and giving them insights. And I was just, it was fascinating to get some background and input from you, and I just appreciate your time today. So thank you again for coming on.
Yes, I mean, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity. And maybe we can do this again. I've got a lot more stories.
I bet you do. Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. Okay, thanks again, Kevin.